All right, let's wrap up our family recipes site. So the next thing I want to do is make our header a little more prominent here. Right now it still seems like it's a little too much part of the site, and since we might have additional recipes on here, I want to make that stand out a little bit more. So if we go back to our HTML, we can see that that is the lone H1 tag in our site, or in our page. So I should be safe to just modify this. So let's add a background here. Let's go a little bit darker than the body background. Yeah, let's change that color a little bit. Okay, sorry about that. We'll keep it right there. Now, one thing you will notice here is that we have this padding that we added to our container, kind of not really making our H1 look all that nice up here. So let's get rid of this padding on the container so that we can have a nice, so that our heading background comes right up to the border. And instead, let's add the padding to the H1. So another reminder of the box model. So let's add that padding to the H1. And now look what we have. Now it's much nicer. Now that background extends all the way out to the edges, and our content is still indented, or still has our padding. So it looks much nicer. Now the only problem is what we do with all this content down here that's now stuck up against the edges. Well, if you go back to our recipes.html, you will see that we have this section called recipes, and I bet if we set a padding on recipes, we could get the same effect down here. So let's create a new rule for recipes and give it a padding of 15 pixels. And there you go. Now we have some nice spacing here, and everything looks good, and we have a more defined header, which I think is going to make things look a little bit better. So let's double check what this extra spacing is up here. And so if we use our inspector, we can see that our H2 has some extra padding on top, just like our H1 did. So just to keep things dry, so we're not repeating ourselves, so dry means do not repeat yourself, let's make a rule for all H1s, H2s, and H3s for the margin to be 0. So now any H1, H2, or H3 tag will inherit the margin 0. So that should fix that. All right, now we're looking good. So the next thing I want to do is change the default font family. This is Times New Roman, and I would prefer Helvetica for this just because. So let's go up to the body and add a font family property and give it Helvetica and a fallback. So if we save that, now you can see we have our Helvetica font. And what I mean by this fallback here is you can list your fonts in order. So if the operating system does not have Helvetica, it will default to just a generic sans serif font, which is what we have here. And remember, sans serif means without the little serifs. So a font like Georgia is a serif font because it has all the little serifs sticking down over it, all the little fancies. And Helvetica, is a sans serif because it doesn't have the serifs. So one other thing I want to do up here is give a little bit extra line height on our site. That looks pretty good. So the line height is kind of like the line spacing in Word. Ooh, I hate to make that comparison, but it kind of is. It's just the line spacing between your text in lines of paragraphs and links, or excuse me, and lists. So we'll get more into line height and font sizing when we talk about typography a little bit later on in some of the more advanced CSS courses. So there's a few other things I want to quickly do to this. First of all, this H1 I think might be better as a white, and this is a good opportunity to use a newer CSS property called text shadow, where we can give our text a little bit of a drop shadow. I think that's a little much on the spread. There, that's better. So, and actually I think I want to give a little more top padding. So you can see there I added just a little more top padding, but we want to keep our 15 pixel left and right padding to match what's in our content area. So on this text shadow property, the values it takes are the X and Y offsets, and then the spread. So how spread out the back, or how spread out the drop shadow is, or the text shadow is. So those of you that have some experience in Photoshop will be familiar with that spread option. You can see it adds a nice little drop shadow effect to our H1 tag. So one last thing I think we can do to this particular site, just to kind of close it out for the time being, is to update this table down here. Now, what I would typically do on tables is to, so if we come down here, is to always set this border to 0. And that will remove it there. And then we can come re-add it back in CSS. And this gives us a little more control. And we can also add our border collapse, which will get rid of those double lines for us. And finally, we can add just a little bit of padding in the inside of our cells. And I think the only other thing we might need is maybe a slight bottom margin on our H3, just to separate it out a little bit. Okay, so I did a few quick things there. I just want to double check and walk through everything with you guys. So I added some additional bottom margin to our H3 because it was a little close to that table, so that little bit of spacing makes it look a little bit better there. The other thing I did was this table styling down here. So what this first rule does is it applies a 1 pixel border to the table row, and the table cell. And this border collapse gets rid of that double border that's kind of a hangover from the HTML table. And then finally, I added a rule for only our table cells to give an additional 5 pixels of padding around each of the values within the elements. And this just makes our table look a little bit better. So that's basically it. That's styling the family recipes page. And as you can see, we have very little CSS here, only about 41 lines. And I bet if I went through there, I could probably make it a little bit smaller and accomplish the same thing. There's a little bit of redundancy there. But generally, it's not a ton of code for the output that you get. So I hope you guys have seen in the last 3 or 4 videos how to start to structure and build out your CSS files. You're going to take what you've learned in these last videos and use them in your personal site project to start building out a little bit more of the CSS there. So I will see you guys next week. Talk to you soon.